Bonjour, Natalie here. Welcome to Franco Foods. Today, I'm going to talk about puff pastry. Why? Well, puff pastry is the base in a variety of recipes, both sweet and savory, all over the world. Since the idea behind Franco Foods is to take a look at the influence of French on the world of food, I thought it made sense to talk about it and to share with you how it's going for me making my own. So, prior to starting, I let the butter I'm going to use get to room temperature. It makes it easier to shape the square I'm going to use to create the pastry. Once it is shaped, I'm going to put it back in the fridge to harden up. It's really important that the butter be cold while you're working with it and making the puff pastry. This is the fourth time I make my own. And I've tried a couple of different techniques, like what they call the, quote-unquote cheat version, where you incorporate lumps of butter directly in the dough. But I am finding that the classic version, which is what I'm doing today, is what seems to be working best for me at this time. Maybe once I get more comfortable with this technique, the cheat version might work better. We'll see. The goal with the butter is to create a square that's roughly 8 by 8 inches. Also, I'm trying my very best to make it even, like the thickness as even as possible. Now for the dough. It's really basic. It's 2 types of flour, salt, and ice cold water. That's it. A little trick I've found that helps me to make sure my water is ice cold. When I'm prepping all my ingredients, I have ice cubes in it, and by the time I'm ready to pour it in, the cubes have melted and the water is super cold. So I don't know, this just seems to work for me. So I'm mixing all the ingredients and I'm going to make a ball. Since I'm doing this by hand, I'm finding that kneading is a great way to incorporate everything together. Now, I realize I could buy frozen puff pastry dough at the store for whenever or whatever I want to make, right? But puff pastry is one of those things I always wanted to be able to make my own. So I took the plunge, and the first time I did it was around the holidays. And since then, well, every once in a while, I pick it up again and I keep practicing. Now, according to the technique I'm following, once the dough is done, I need to wrap it in a damp cloth and refrigerate it. I don't know why, but hey, who am I to argue with Julia Child, This week's vocabulary is la pâtisserie, abaisser une pâte, feuilletée, sucré, salé. The dough and the butter have been in the fridge together, and they're both at the same or similar temperature. So it's time to roll out the dough and incorporate the butter. So of course, in preparing for this episode, I just had to look into the history of puff pastry. Well, I was not surprised to find out that France is where this pastry originated from. What did surprise me, however, is how long ago puff pastry was invented. It was invented around 1645 by a French baker's apprentice named Claudius Gel. Hopefully, that's how he would have pronounced it. Okay, so I'm rolling out the dough so it's big enough to wrap the sheet of butter. And it needs to be properly, completely covered. No butter can be peeking through. Now the fun starts. Time to roll, fold, and turn. Each time, I'm going to roll the dough to a length of 24 inches. Then I'm going to fold it into thirds. And then I give it a quarter turn. The reason to do this is it creates alternating layers of dough and butter. You see, puff pastry is a dough with no leavening agent like yeast, not even baking powder or baking soda, as you can see, but it still puffs up. That's thanks to the butter. When the pastry is baking, the butter melts and it releases steam, and the steam makes the layers separate. That's how the dough rises or puffs up. It also makes the dough really nice and flaky, and boy, if you've had puff pastry, quite delicious. Apparently, Claudius Gel invented puff pastry because his father was sick, and the doctor said he could only eat flour, water, and butter. So basically, he was on a diet of water, bread, and butter. Boy, these were certainly different times. Can you imagine that today? Okay. Darn. So the dough's torn, and I've got some seepage of my butter, so it's peeking through. That's not a good thing, because what's probably going to happen is when I do bake the pastry, it's not going to rise as well. I have to say that rolling part is definitely the biggest challenge for me. I think it's partially because I tend to handle the dough too much and I'm kind of slow at it, and so my butter gets too warm. I tend to do 2 turns and then put the dough back in the fridge to cool off again. Usually between 30 and 60 minutes for that. But I'm thinking at least until I get faster at rolling and folding, maybe I should do it at each turn. Again, it's like anything else, practice, practice, practice. On the upside, my technique has improved from my first attempt. Trust me on that. When all the turns are done, the puff pastry is going to have 994 layers of dough and 993 layers of butter. It's probably where the millefeuille gets its name. Millefeuille is the French name for Napoleons. Mille means 1,000 and feuille means sheet, or in this case you could say layer. So I guess the French kind of decided to round up. At the end of the day, puff pastry is a trickier pastry to make than others I've made so far, so I definitely need to keep practicing. But I do find there's a difference in the taste of the homemade versus the frozen store-bought. And it's so versatile. You can use it for so many things like pies, such as the Belgian tarte au maton. And it makes a great crust for like a chicken or turkey pot pie. And of course, Napoleons, turnovers, a savory or sweet braid, variety of appetizers, and so much more. I know I have a lot of practicing to do to improve, if not perfect, my technique, but I don't mind. It's a lot of fun. I usually wind up not only making the puff pastry, but trying new bakes with it. And my family doesn't seem to mind either. Just a note, usually this recipe, I split the finished dough into 2, and more often than not, I'll use one part right away for something and then I'll freeze the other part for another time. Okay, well, I hope this episode encourages you to try making your own puff pastry. The recipe and the technique are in the description. If you do make your own, let me know. Have a great week. Merci et à la prochaine.